Good morning, everyone. Welcome. If you are still in need of a handout, Mr. Jay Thompson in the back center is handing out the papers. He has ones with blanks, and this week I decided to add an extra option, ones without blanks. They're already filled in, so if you don't feel like doing any schoolwork this morning, you can get one with them already filled in. Before we continue our class on the history of the Christian church in the Roman Empire, let's have a word of prayer and then we'll get started. Lord, thank you for this morning, for the beautiful weather outside. And Lord, once again, we thank you for how you worked and you led your church in many of its darkest days, and how, Lord, that's an encouragement even to us as we look ahead and see clouds on the horizon. We know, Lord, that there are many believers who have gone through far worse things than any of us have. And Lord, we thank you for how you encouraged those who went through persecution, how you continue to do so today. Lord, bless our study this morning. Give me the right words to say. In Jesus' name, amen. So if you were here with us last week, we did a very quick run-through summary of the history of the Roman civilization from kind of start to the end of the New Testament. Someone told me it was like drinking water from a fire hose, and I understand it probably was like that. We ended with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD and the end of Roman tolerance, so to speak, for Jewish semi-independence. And then around that same time, it's going to be, of course, the rise of the Christian church we're going to talk about today. So last week was a brief review of the history of Rome. Today, we're going to spend most of our time talking about the relationship between Rome and the early Christian church, and especially about persecution of Christians during the Roman Empire period. And the next week, we'll see the turnaround of that, where Christianity went from being the most persecuted group of people in the Roman Empire to, well, the complete opposite, in fact. I thought I'd comment very briefly a little bit about what Roman religion was like. And that's something that could take hours to do because it's very fiendishly complicated, and of course it changed over time. But I thought I'd make a few observations about why were the Romans so hostile to Christianity, and how did Christianity violate their idea of what true religion should be. Of course, as many of you know, Roman religion was very polytheistic, and it was linked very much inseparably to the idea of patriotism and civic duty. Roman religion was also very contractual, and that it was kind of viewed that you did things for the gods and then they would do things in return for you. In fact, there's a common phrase the Romans used that went basically like this: I give that you might give, something they may say at a ceremony or a ritual. And that it was civic, that it was part of being a good citizen, and that if you didn't partake in pagan rituals, then you weren't being a good citizen. And it would really mark you out as somebody being different. It would be like, I don't know, to use something more relevant to us, it would be like if you didn't celebrate the 4th of July almost, maybe worse than that. Something very obvious that if you didn't participate in it, not only were you not religious, you weren't being a good member of the general society, because it was very much their belief that if people neglected the worship of the gods, that would result in, bad things happening to them in the future. The Romans often attributed, when they were going through good times, they would attribute their success to their piety or their pietas, that they were doing well because the gods favored them, because they, did things like this, worshipped at temples, built them, honored them, and so forth and so on. The Romans often created, of course, plenty of idols of various gods, and even incorporated them into other more mundane things like coins. Perhaps you may recognize which, actually this is a Greek goddess, of course that the Romans adopted. It's an inscription of Athena on a Roman coin. That is a Roman bronze statue of Mars. I assume he was holding a weapon when this statue was originally made, and then that went away more than the statue itself did. This is a bronze figure of Artemis, and you might know that the Romans were very much open to incorporating other religious cults and pantheons into their group of gods. They did so famously with the Greeks. They would do so with the Egyptians too. So if they came across another polytheistic civilization, they would just kind of absorb them all into theirs. Another feature of Roman religion, of course, as the empire period progressed, was the idea of emperor worship. Not a new idea, not an idea that the Romans invented. This is probably also an idea that they borrowed from the Greeks. For instance, Alexander the Great also kind of propped himself up as a god. And this began after the death of Julius Caesar. The Roman historian Suetonius tells us that he died in the 56th year of his age and was numbered among the gods, not only by a formal decree by his heir, Augustus, but also in the conviction of the common people. And Augustus held ceremonies and games and such in the honor of his predecessor. Later in the Roman Empire, when things became more authoritarian as far as the government structure became, so too did the emperor worship. The emperor worship usually only took place after an emperor died. So you would have an emperor, he would die, he would be deified after his death as sort of a, measure of humbleness. But during the later Roman Empire, during a period we often refer to as the Dominate, which means the latter half of the Roman Empire where the government became less, I told you last week that Emperor Augustus tended to maintain the facade of the Roman Republic and kept the Senate, and they had elections, and they would go through the motions of a republic, but in fact they were more of a veiled dictatorship. Well, that went away by the 3rd or 4th century, and instead the Roman dictatorship is very obvious and very blatant. And one of those ways it became blatant is that emperor worship became much more straightforward and included the living emperor as well. As a good example of that would be Emperor Diocletian. So how did Rome then react to the rise of Christianity? Well, the answer is at first, not a whole lot. At first, the Romans considered Christianity to just be an offshoot of Judaism, and they were very reluctant to get involved in anything that had anything to do with Christians, or when the Jews would accuse Christians of being criminals or violating the law. The Romans really wanted nothing to do with this, and we have a fantastic example of that in action in the Bible. It's one of those kind of random stories that, of course, it isn't random, it's always on purpose, but it's not a great passage of theological discussion, but it's a great human story. This comes from Acts 18. I'll read the passage for you. It's Paul is in Greece, and he's been arrested by the Jews there who are mad at him for preaching the gospel, and they drag him before the Roman official, and this is the interaction that we get. This is Acts 18. It says, when Gallio was the deputy of Achaia, that's Greece, the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, this fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law. All right, so that's the common accusation being made at Christians. And then we get this sentence. And when Paul was now about to open his mouth, Gallio said unto the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or wicked lewdness, O ye Jews, reason would that I should bear with you. But if it be a question of words and names and of your law, look ye into it, for I will be no judge of such matters. And he drave them from the judgment seat. I don't know about you, but that must have been a comical scene. I can almost see this Roman official kind of like rubbing his temples, like he hasn't had his morning coffee yet. He's like, guys, I don't want to deal with this. Go away. Yeah, I don't care. Go, deal with your, nerdy religious dispute somewhere else. And that would have been a fairly common attitude around the New Testament times. When I was reading about this subject matter, when I originally taught this class, I read that some interesting tidbits about what the early church would have been like. The early church by the Romans was not really necessarily originally viewed as a separate religion, but more of like a club or an association, because Christians behaved like that. You have to understand, in Roman culture at the time, of course, there's no such thing as any sort of public healthcare system. In fact, there are very few public services whatsoever. Even firefighting services are famously privatized in Rome. There was a Roman senator who kind of pioneered the idea of having a fire brigade, although you had to pay for the firefighting services, and if you had not paid, they wouldn't put out the fire. So if you had a fire in your house, the brigade would often show up to your house and say, hey, we'll put that fire out if you pay us. And of course, many people would be pressured into doing so since their house is burning down. Sometimes it was alleged that they themselves had been the ones to set the fire to drum up business, so to speak. So a club or association, what does that mean? Well, it means that Roman citizens often would kind of create unofficial, loose organizations among themselves to help pay for things like, especially funerals and burial plots, and things like that. And the Christians did those sort of things. And this is kind of what the actions that kind of marked them out as such. They would meet for common meals, that they had an initiation ceremony, that they had different rules and regulations for their members. A big one is helping pay for the needs of members, whether that's food or clothing or anything like that. The fact that they elected officers is also a mark of a Roman era kind of private citizen association. And there were a few other things that we know that are from the Bible, from the book of Acts in particular, that show us that they did these things. For instance, in Acts 4, when it talks about believers pooling their resources, even goes so far as to say that they didn't really view the stuff that they owned as belonging to them, but it belonged to the church, to their group, that they pooled their things that closely together. In the very next chapter, we have an example of course, Ananias and Sapphira, who violated those rules and were severely punished for lying about what they had contributed. And then the next chapter is a familiar passage to us in which the rules and expectations for how to choose deacons is described. So that was something that would have been readily familiar to early Christians at the time, was pooling their resources together into, the English word club or association, maybe it's not the right idea, but that wouldn't have been totally foreign to them. An early church father, Tertullian, describes it this way: we are an association bound together by our religious profession, by the unity of our way of life, and the bond of our common hope. We meet together as an assembly and as a society. We pray for the emperors. We gather together to read our sacred writing. With the holy words, we nourish our faith. After the gathering is over, the Christians go out as though they had come from a school of virtue. And so this is a very early description of what church would have been like, so to speak. And he's really writing a defense of Christians because there's all kinds of wild accusations, that they're cannibals, that they're rebels, that they're plotting the overthrow of the emperor and that kind of thing. And he says, no, we don't do anything like that. We pray, we even pray for the benefit of our government, even though it's not necessarily friendly to us. And we read the scriptures. And he's basically saying it's such a wholesome event that when Christians leave, they are better people than they were before. They've improved their virtue. And then he kind of concludes this way: but who has ever suffered harm from our assemblies? We are in our congregations just what we are when separated from each other. So in other words, he's saying there's no secret occultist kind of stuff going on. We are as a community what we are as individuals. We injure nobody, we trouble nobody. And unfortunately, he's having to say those kinds of things because there's a growing sense among the Roman civilization, Roman people, that the Christians are a threat of some kind. Tertullian, by the way, lived in North Africa from the years 160 to 220. He wrote this at about 197 AD, if you're wanting to keep track of dates here. And he's also the first Christian writer to use the term Trinity, interestingly enough, Trinitas. But generally, Christians were unpopular in Roman society, even before persecution began. And there's a few kind of reasons to do that, to explain that. Christians at the time just didn't participate in things that were expected of good Roman citizens. Most Christians would not run for political office. Because running for political office meant that you had to participate in pagan rituals. Now, of course, there were Christians who became saved after they had already gotten into office, and that spooked the Romans maybe more than anything. But many Christians would not run for political office. Again, that's another unpatriotic thing to do. And as I said, they would not participate in pagan rituals, or festivals, and they had those all the time. There was always some sort of festival or holiday of some kind happening, and Christians didn't get involved in them. And a big one is most Christians would not serve in the military. And again, this for the same reasons as not running for political office, and often those two are basically the same thing. Serving in the government is almost the same thing as serving in the military, because you'd have to partake in the rituals, you would have to worship the emperor, and so that wasn't something that many Christians were comfortable doing. So from the Roman point of view, they're at the height of their civilization, they're at the height of their pride and their sort of zeal in their Roman ideals, and then you have this group of people who don't do those things and seemingly meet in private, and you don't understand them or where they're coming from, and it just seems at random people are converting to it. There's no specific ethnicity, there's no specific part of the empire they're necessarily all concentrated from, and worst of all, they witness to people. As I said last week, part of the reason the Romans were able to tolerate the existence of Jews is that Jews didn't try to spread their faith, Christians did, and they often did very quickly and alarmingly to the Romans. So then that leads us to persecution. Now, Roman persecution of Christians was very much a on-again, off-again kind of affair. Sometimes it was done with government approval, and sometimes it was just sporadic and done by individual citizens. We can say with some certainty that the first official Roman persecution of Christians occurred under the famous, infamous really, Emperor Nero. Now, Nero was a terrible person in many ways, and this is just simply one of them. The story goes is that there was a large fire in the city of Rome, and it burned down a significant portion of the city. And Nero's popularity had already been kind of wavering at this point, and so he needed someone to take the blame for this. He needed a scapegoat. And so he blamed the Christians for burning down the city. Now, of course, why would they do that? Who knows? But he's trying to paint them basically as terrorists. But there was a pretty substantial rumor that actually the fire was started by him or on his orders. And that's something that historians even debate to this day. Nero wasn't actually even in the city when the fire started. But it was noticed that after the fire torched mostly residential area of Rome, that he built a palace on the ruins of those people's homes. They were not rebuilt. He built his own palace on there, which probably didn't help his popularity. And Tacitus, the Roman historian, tells us a little bit about what was going through the mind of Nero and the people of Rome at the time, right after this terrible fire. He tells us, from Nero's point of view, "But neither human help nor imperial munificence, nor all the modes of placating heaven could stifle scandal or dispel the belief, or the rumor, that the fire had taken place by order. Therefore, to scotch the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd had styled Christians." Tacitus then gives us the origin, because he's writing to an audience who may not even know who these people are, and he says, "Christus," that's his version of Jesus Christ, "the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and the pernicious superstition was checked for the moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but even in the capital itself." By the way, that's now two secular historians that I've quoted from in this class who directly testified to the existence of Jesus Christ and who he was and what he did. And so every once in a while, you hear about people, saying, oh, was Jesus Christ real? Was he not? Maybe he was just a historical figure. He definitely was, and you could even point to secular historians at the time who knew that. Speaking of the spread of Christianity, this map kind of helpfully shows that Christianity would show up in splotches, mostly in urban centers, as you may notice from that map, big cities and would often be the first places where people would start churches. Of course, we know from reading our New Testaments that a lot of that explanation comes from people like Paul, right, and other apostles who would just go on missionary journeys very far away and spread the gospel all over the world at the time. You know, in my history classes at Colonial, we talk about the fact that the Bible describes Jesus as coming in the fullness of time, right? That it was an ideal time for the gospel to spread to the world because of all the different conditions that were true at that time. And within that, map of the Roman civilization, it really was that way, that people like Paul and Peter and others could travel around the empire. They could do so with generally relative safety, and they could speak and communicate to virtually anyone, especially if they knew Greek. And therefore, that kind of created the perfect conditions for Christianity to spread, and to spread very quickly, despite even government opposition. Tacitus then goes on to tell us what happened to these Christians in Rome specifically, who were accused of starting the fire. He says they were covered with wild beast skins and torn to death by dogs, or they were fastened on crosses, and when daylight failed, were burned to serve as lamps by night. And there are stories of Nero throwing late night parties and human crosses being used to illuminate his palace. There arose a certain sentiment of pity, Tacitus concludes, due to the impression that they were being sacrificed not for the welfare of the state, but to the ferocity of a single man. And so even Tacitus admits, he's not so sure that the Christians really deserve this. This kind of seems like just because Nero hates them for some reason. So despite all of this, the Roman persecution of Christians at the time was mostly limited to Rome itself. Nero didn't really start an empire-wide program to persecute Christians, probably because at the time he didn't really know where they were and they weren't as widespread. That mostly took place in Rome itself. And even afterwards, it was very clear that there was no specific plan for what to do with Christians. No uniform policy seems to have existed for Christians, but we do know that by about the 2nd century or so, that the government was starting to treat being a Christian as a capital offense. Not consistently, but it did happen on occasion, and sometimes on a fairly large scale. We have a good example of this because of a series of letters that were written back and forth between the Roman Emperor Trajan and one of his governors in the east, whose name was Pliny. And I think it's a fascinating exchange because Pliny is encountering Christians, and he does not know what to do with them. And so he writes to Trajan and tells him, basically he's reporting to his boss. He tells him what he did, and then Trajan responds. And I'll read you some of this exchange. A little bit of background, though. Pliny was governor of Bithynia and Pontus. And that is that, if you can see on that map, that shaded in area of what is today Turkey on the Black Sea coast. And if that sounds a little bit familiar to you, you might be reminded of how the book of 1 Peter begins, in which Peter writes to Christians in this very same area. It says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Those are all regions in what is today modern Turkey, or what we would sometimes call Asia Minor, or you could use the term Anatolia, or to the Romans, that was just Asia, basically. And he goes on to tell them, elect according to the foreknowledge of God and the Father, through sanctification of the Spirit, unto obedience and sprinkling of the blood of Jesus Christ, grace unto you and peace be multiplied. And towards the few verses later, he tells them he's continuing to describe who they are and encouraging them. This is who you are, who are kept by the power of God through faith unto salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time, wherein ye greatly rejoice, though now for a season, if need be, ye are in heaviness through manifold temptations, that the trial of your faith, being much more precious than of gold, that perisheth, though it be tried with fire, might be found unto praise and honor and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ. And so Peter is he's acknowledging that these are people who are going through difficult times and they're being persecuted. And that letter is written right about the time that this exchange happens between Pliny and Trajan. So Pliny writes to the emperor, "I have never been present at any trials of Christians. Therefore, I do not know the methods or the limits to be observed either in examining or punishing them." So he's admitting, I don't know what to do with these people. They're Christians. I know that's bad, but I've never, this guy was a lawyer and been to law school, and he's like, I don't know what to do with them. So, he doesn't do nothing. He tells the emperor what he did. "In the meanwhile, the method I have observed towards those who have been denounced as Christians is this. I asked them personally whether they were Christians, and if they confessed it, I repeated the question a second and third time, adding the threat of capital punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered to be executed." And so that was just kind of the plan that he went with. And then the emperor responds, "You have followed the right course of procedure, my dear Secundus," or my second in command, my lieutenant, "in investigating the cases of those brought before you as Christians. It is not possible to lay down any general rule which can be applied as the fixed standard in all cases of this nature." So he doesn't know what to do either. In fact, he doesn't even say that they should always be executed. He's just saying, good job, keep it up. Pliny then continues to report about Christians. He says later, "They declared that the sum total of their guilt or error amounted to no more than this, that they had met regularly before dawn on a fixed day to chant verses alternately among themselves in honor of Christ as if to a god, and also to bind themselves by oath, not for any criminal purpose, but to abstain from theft, robbery, and adultery, to commit no breach of trust, and not to deny a deposit when called upon to restore it. After this ceremony, it had been their custom to disperse and reassemble later to take food of an ordinary, harmless kind." So what Pliny's telling us that later on, he kind of did some investigation. He found out what Christians actually did, and that's it. He just finds out, they're actually just kind of nice people, and they meet, and they don't do bad things. They're good people. They actually try to be honest, and with their conversation and with their finances. And he didn't find any evidence, supposedly, of terrible things that they did. But that didn't really... And so it's that kind of pattern where the Romans would be convinced that the Christians were evil, persecute them, actually find out what they were like, and be like, okay, actually they're not that terrible. Back off, and then there'd be a period of peace, and then the cycle would start over again. Especially once there was a problem in Rome and the emperor needed someone to blame. Another story from about this time period is the martyrdom of a man named Polycarp. And Polycarp was an elderly church father, and he was arrested for being a Christian. And there was a letter sent between churches that recorded, partially from an eyewitness standpoint, of what happened to Polycarp at his martyrdom. And I thought it was a really interesting story, and I wanted to share it with you. You might get the feeling by now that I really like reading primary sources, and it's not going to stop, sorry. But this one's interesting. This comes from a letter called The Martyrdom of Polycarp. "And when finally he," that's Polycarp, "was brought up, there was a great tumult on hearing that Polycarp had been arrested. Therefore, when he was brought before him, the proconsul asked him if he were Polycarp. And when he confessed that he was, he tried to persuade him to deny the faith. And the Roman official told him, say things like, 'Have respect to your age,' and other things that customarily follow this, such as, 'Swear by the fortune of Caesar,' 'Change your mind,' say, 'Away with the atheists.'" And you might be wondering, with who? The Romans, one of their gripes with Christians is they often accuse them of being atheists. And the reason for that is because the Christians weren't polytheistic. And so the Christians would often say, no, Mars and Jupiter and Saturn are not gods. They're false gods, and the Romans just couldn't understand the idea there being only one God, and so one of the things they would accuse the Christians of is being atheists. But Polycarp looked with earnest face at the whole crowd of lawless heathen in the arena and motioned to them with his hand. Then groaning and looking up to heaven, he said, "Away with the atheists." And I think that's funny. They told him to say that to the Christians, and he's like, yeah, okay. And instead, he motioned his hand at the Romans and said to God, "Away with the atheists." I don't think that won him any favor with the proconsul. And yet the proconsul was insistent and said, "Take the oath, and I shall release." He's really reluctant to kill this guy, probably because he was very old, and he felt bad about that. He said, "Take the oath, and I shall release you. Curse Christ." Polycarp said, 86 years I have served him, and he never did me any wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? And that was the last argument he made, and the proconsul relented, and Polycarp was burned at the stake. That kind of off and on persecution persisted. I was reading a little bit about from Fox's Book of Martyrs, and according to his kind of view of persecution of the church, he marks out 10 distinct sporadic episodes of persecution of Christians. The final episode, and easily the most widespread, happens under the reign of Emperor Diocletian. Diocletian may be a Roman emperor you're familiar with. He is definitely on the kind of latter half of the Roman Empire. He actually comes to power during a period of immense crisis in the Roman Empire. A lot of people ask the question, why did the Roman Empire fall? And there are entire books written on that topic. And it's one of those things that I tell my students this, because they ask me that question. And I say, the more you study the Romans, the less your question becomes, why did it fall? And more your question becomes, why did it last as long as it did? And why didn't it fall earlier? Well, one of the reasons it didn't fall earlier is because of this man, Diocletian. As I mentioned last week, when the Republic ended, Rome became an imperial state with a dictator. As you know from history, that any civilization that does that runs a very big risk, because when you concentrate that much power in the hands of one individual, that makes that position very tempting to get. Because if you get that position, you get everything. Being president of the United States is very prestigious and powerful, and it can lead to all kinds of wealth and such like that, but it's not the same as being emperor. And the Roman civilization had a real big problem with the fact that they never decided how emperors would be succeeded. There was never a codified process created for what happens when the Roman emperor dies. Now, in our thinking, we would just assume, well, his son becomes emperor, right? That actually very rarely ever happened. Rarely it was that a son would succeed his father as emperor. Usually, what would happen for most of Roman history, especially when you get outside that initial period of peace from Emperor Augustus's reign, the Pax Romana, Rome would basically just have a civil war every time the emperor died, because all the major generals in the army, their legions would proclaim them their general to be emperor, and then they would all fight in this kind of free for all, and then whoever came out last man standing would become emperor, and then he would rule for 5 or 6 years, die or get assassinated, and then the whole process would start all over again. And Roman legions loved doing this, because if their general became emperor and they are the ones who pushed him onto the throne, it was expected, of course, that they would get a big payout from doing that. And if the Roman emperor didn't pay them off, then they would often kill him and replace him with somebody else. Diocletian came to the throne during a period where this was happening frequently, when, in fact, the empire actually briefly fragmented into 3 separate states, and after a period of warfare was reunified. Diocletian also began the process of dividing the empire into multiple pieces for the sake of making administration simpler and more streamlined. He came up with the idea of dividing the empire into 4 different pieces, and his plan was that it was kind of like in pairs. Okay, the 2 east and the 2 west would kind of go together, and there would be a senior ruler over 1 quarter of the empire, and each of those 2 senior officials would have the title Augustus. And then the other 2 quarters would be ruled by a lesser official known as a Caesar. And the Caesar was supposed to be a younger man who would be kind of the presumptive heir to the Augustus. So he was trying to create a line of succession, and it didn't work at all. But Diocletian, part of his reforming plan for strengthening the Roman Empire at the time, was also trying to bring internal order and conformity to the government. And there was a lot of different things that he did. Rome was having big problems with inflation. We can relate, right? Although you and I at least benefit from living in a society that knows what inflation is. The Romans did not. They didn't actually understand, really, that printing or minting more coins actually made existing coins less valuable. Because, of course, those coins are all, have a metal content. That metal content doesn't change. And so they would mint lesser valued coins to increase the money supply, but then people would just hoard the more valuable coins, and it was a mess. I shouldn't get into that right now. More relevant to what we're talking about then is what Diocletian did to Christians. Diocletian began an empire-wide persecution of Christians with the intent to annihilate Christianity permanently and to basically bring back all Roman citizens to Roman paganism, or even there was actually a fairly new cult that had begun with the government's approval, worship of the sun, or Sol Invictus, is what that was known as. Some of you have asked, what does the name of my class mean? It's called Roma Invicta. Roma Invicta means Rome unconquered, or Rome undefeated. And he wanted to bring back that kind of propaganda to the Roman civilization and get everyone on the same page religiously. And so that's when you have a lot of persecution of Christians happening, not just in Rome, but around the empire. This is, we famously think about Christians being thrown to wild animals in the Colosseum. That absolutely happened during this time period. They were thrown to wild animals. They were burned on crosses. They were attacked by gladiators. Anything that would cause entertainment to the people in the Colosseum. And of course, the Romans built similar arenas to that all around the empire, and that happened in those places too. He also ordered that churches be destroyed, that pastors be arrested and executed or imprisoned. Specifically, he targeted copies of the scriptures, and he wanted all copies of the Bible destroyed. And he ordered all of his governors all across the empire to do this. And a Roman historian from the time period tells us a little bit about that. This comes from a guy named Eusebius, another secular historian, describing Diocletian's persecution of Christians. He says, it was the 19th year of the reign of Diocletian, an imperial letter was everywhere promulgated, ordering the razing of the churches to the ground and the destruction by fire of the scriptures, and the proclaiming that those who held high positions would lose all civil rights, while those in the households, if they persisted in their profession of Christianity, would be deprived of their liberty. So what he's saying is, if you were a high-class person who was a Christian, your punishment for being a Christian, if you recanted at least, would be less than if you were a lower-class person. Such was the first document against us, but not long afterwards we were further visited with other letters, and in them the order was given that the presidents of the churches should all, in every place, be first committed to prison, and then afterwards compelled by every kind of device to sacrifice. And what he's hinting at is every kind of device is torture and that sort of thing. Sometimes Christian historians call this 8-year period the Great Persecution under Diocletian. It happens from the years 303 to 311. Again, from Fox's Book of Martyrs, I was reading a story that I thought I'd share. Of course, he just lists person after person after person who was martyred, and as many details about them as we know. He says, one that I wrote down, Romanus, a native of Palestine, was deacon of the church of Caesarea at the time of the commencement of Diocletian's persecution. Being condemned for his faith at Antioch, he was scourged, put to the rack, his body torn with hooks, his flesh cut with knives, his face scarified, his teeth beaten from their sockets, and his hair plucked up by the roots. Soon after, he survived all of that. Soon after, he was ordered to be strangled. It's estimated that at least 5,000 Christians were publicly martyred by the Roman government during this persecution, though it's possible that that number was much higher. And despite all of that, as we know, the persecution didn't work, did it? In fact, it really kind of petered out towards the end of that 8-year period. It failed to stop the spread of Christianity. It was widespread, it was harsh, but it didn't work. As for that number of martyrs, by the way, an estimate of somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 is considered a conservative estimate, so kind of split the difference a little bit there. And as a kind of a hint to next week, that persecution ends in 311. The government edict legalizing Christianity and permanently stopping the persecution of Christians comes in 313 AD. That's the Edict of Milan, but we'll talk about that next week. A book I read for this class, again, it's a secular historian writing about the persecution of Christians, and towards the end, he's having to describe, kind of like, why didn't the persecution of Christians work? Why didn't Diocletian's purge succeed? And this is what he had to say. Diocletian's first directives were aimed at decapitating the faith by arresting the bishops, destroying the formal places of worship, and burning the sacred texts. Only later would measures be directed against the broader membership of the church, because decapitating the leadership wasn't working, so he expanded it to the common people. And then the persecution was greatly hindered by the unwieldy nature of imperial bureaucracy. So what he's saying is, it's hard to eliminate an entire group of people who are spread out over your empire, who could be of any class, of any ethnicity, of any background, of any position, high or low, and to do this, in an ancient civilization where everything is done on parchment or something like that. And then he concludes that the tetrarchs, that's the rulers of the 4 different parts of the empire that Diocletian had created, found it difficult to enforce widespread compliance with the measures directed against the Christians because many local officials only half-heartedly carried out their instructions. And why would that be? Why would some of his officials and governors only half-heartedly carry out their instructions? Well, his idea is that this lack of zeal among local officials may lie in the fact that by this time, the Christians were a known quantity, kind of like Pliny had discovered after he executed quite a few and found out, oh, this is what they're actually like. People who, even if they were prone to a rather embarrassingly strident monotheism, which didn't conform with Roman ideals, were nonetheless respectable in their personal and ethical conduct and performed many works of charity. Moreover, Christians were now found at every level of society. So he says the governors didn't want to kill Christians because they thought they were good people, they were good citizens, they were hardworking, they were honest. In fact, there's a story of several Roman governors going to Diocletian and protesting against the persecution, and they were executed for doing so. But even they felt that it was unfair to target Christians in this manner. And so that's why this persecution, not only does it kind of fizzle out, but in fact, a total reversal of it happens just a couple of years later, although that will require a new emperor named Constantine. When I read that, I was reminded of a passage from Matthew 5. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. And certainly that is something that the early Christians understood and did, and it made a big difference in when the people who tried to kill them lost. It's a lot easier, psychologically for people to kill and to commit genocide and that kind of thing if they really do believe that who they're killing is a threat to them or is somehow, subhuman. And instead, when they came across Christians, that just wasn't the case. And their testimony showed the Romans that their faith was real. And that had a pretty profound impact on quite a number of them. And we'll be talking about that next week and the legalization of Christianity. I have like 5 extra minutes that I wasn't planning on. And I thought maybe now after 2 weeks, if I could maybe take questions, and it could be about anything. I don't have Google pulled up, so I can't guarantee I'll know every answer. But one of the downsides of being here in the auditorium versus in a smaller room is that you're all out there and I'm way up here. But I thought maybe if anyone has any questions, I could potentially comment. It could be about what we're talking about here or something else. Maybe something you'd like me to explain again that I talked about today more clearly, that is also relevant. Yes, sir? That's right. That's right. That's right. Thank you. That's all right. Yes, sir. Steve.
We always hear the stories of Christians in the Colosseum and the lions and all of that. Is that true, or because I didn't hear a lot of that?
Yeah. Let's see. Go back to this image here. Yes, it is true. And the Colosseum, I could talk about that for a while. The Colosseum's purpose was to facilitate blood sports for Roman audiences. And yes, they would keep animals. The Romans loved to see exotic. It was kind of like a very perverted zoo. They loved to see exotic animals from beyond Italy. But what they would do is they would keep them in cages. Now, the Colosseum originally, if you go to the Colosseum today, what you can see is really the understories of the you don't see the platform would have been a lot higher. What you see is what would have been beneath it. And the Romans had an elaborate system of pulleys and elevators where they could very quickly bring up animals or soldiers or gladiators, whatever, up to the surface. And they would keep animals beneath the Colosseum. They would intentionally starve them when there were not games going on, so that they would be, horrendously hungry. And yes, they would put Christians out there. They would bring up wild animals like lions and others, and they would be torn to shreds. Actually, the Romans had been doing stuff like that even before Christians had been put into the Colosseum, but they would usually do that with like criminals and prisoners and things like that. So it is true, and it was something that was pretty common for a time. But they would, anything they could do to create a spectacle in the Colosseum, they would do. Even for a time, the Roman Colosseum was outfitted to be flooded with water, and they would turn it into a giant pool and actually reenact naval battles from Roman history, and they would have galleys and ships out there in the Colosseum fighting each other. And all these battles would be real. They wanted actual blood being spilled. And even today, the sewer system, that's not the right word, the water system that would bring water into the Colosseum still exists. And some of it's still functional. But yes, to answer your question, yes, the blood sport with Christians was real. Yes, sir.
Yeah, at the time of Jonah, when he went to Nineveh, they say that at the time that I heard that what they would do is they would put a rope around them with oil soaked around them. At that time, they didn't have Christians, they had Jews. Is that correct? And they would burn them on fire and they would spin them like a top?
Yes. Right, because the Bible tells us the Ninevites were especially known for their torture expertise. Isn't it always astounding, the creativity that people can come up with for execution and torture? I don't know if the Romans did that, but the Romans were mostly known for crucifixions. That was kind of their method of torture plus execution, was something that they were particularly known for. Yes?
How did they identify Christians in the communities? Was this just like people that were upset against Christians ratting them out, or was this just people who were known?
That's a great question. How were Christians identified? Especially in the early days, it was usually them being accused of being a Christian. So, as if that was a great, terrible thing. And that would come from probably someone, a non-Christian, who would have figured it out, or maybe they tried to witness to them and they then decided to turn them into the government. It could be a Jewish community, like we've seen before, especially in the early days, who would, and their way of kind of getting at Christians would be to, to tell on them to the Romans. And then it would just be as simple, especially later on when the government became more and more involved in trying to find Christians, is they would just ask them. Like the story with Pliny the Younger I was talking about earlier, and there's many more stories like that, is they would just ask people, are you a Christian? And they would say, yes. And then they would say, are you sure? Because this is a capital offense. They would make it very clear there's going to be physical consequences for you saying yes, and they would give them all kinds of opportunities to say no, and people would just continue to say yes. So either you were turned in by someone, or you just freely admitted it, which plenty of them did. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
So there's many examples in the Bible about Roman centurions, like Cornelius, turning to Christ, and soldiers, Paul,
Yes.
turning to Christ. So what would have been the implications if you were a soldier in the Roman army and you turned to Christ?
That's a good question. The question was, what would be the implications or the consequences of a soldier, even an officer, converting to Christianity? In the early days, like the stories we have in the New Testament, very little consequence because there's no official Roman persecution of Christians happening. There's no blowback for being, especially if you're an aristocrat, higher class individual. There's no consequence at first. I was reading, and I don't have it written down, so the details escape me. But there was during Diocletian's persecution. In other words, the short answer is things would be bad for you as a soldier, especially during official times of persecution, such as Diocletian's persecution, because he did comb through the legions and try to. One of his objectives, he actually wrote a letter to his other tetrarchs, and one of the orders he gives is to search through the legions, root out the Christians, especially Christian officers like centurions, and get them out. Sometimes, particularly if they're lower class recruits or that sort of thing, they may be executed. A lot of the times it was just, as with most civilizations, they're reluctant to execute nobles, like higher class people. They don't generally do that, but they would at least do like the next best thing, which was exile them, seize their property. Of course, a centurion would lose his commission in the military. He would lose his retirement benefits. He would lose any land he's been given, and he'd be kicked out of the army and almost certainly into poverty. The consequences would be pretty brutal. By the time we get to Diocletian and such, it was a lot of pressure in the army to conform, because in the army, they would then, when they knew Christians were around, would start to really emphasize the whole give offerings to Caesar, give offerings to the gods, and they would just line the men up and just see who didn't participate. And then, like I keep saying, it's going to be a total 180 next week when instead they're like, actually, everyone has to be a Christian. Well, I should probably cut it off there. Thank you again for coming to my class. And if you think of any other questions, feel free to stop me in the hallway, but I better wrap it up. How about we close with a word of prayer, and then next week we'll conclude our study. Father, thank you for this time we could spend together, and Lord, bless our service to come this morning, and that it would be glorifying to you. Thank you, Lord, for the freedoms that we enjoy, and that we don't have to worry about persecution and trials like many of these Christians did. But Lord, if we ever do, give us the strength to face them. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.